About Jewish music in progressive synagogues in the UK. Now, I have extensive experience as a cantor in America. I served congregations. I started doing Jewish music in America in 1965, my first synagogue choir position. And when I was in Toronto, I worked across the hall from Ben Steinberg, who is the dean, still living, fortunately, although he's over 90 now, but the dean of composers of North American Jewish music. And he really is extremely well informed, and I am too. And neither of us had any idea of the music in the synagogues, in Anglo Jewry and the progressive synagogues. So, first of all, I need to tell you something about the way progressive Judaism is organized, if that's the right word, in the United Kingdom. There are, to begin with, two progressive movements. I don't know how many people are familiar with this. Yeah. Two progressive movements. One is called Liberal Judaism, and it dates originally from 1902, the Union of Liberal and Progressive Synagogues. It's used the terminology of liberal and progressive kind of interchangeably. So there's a Birmingham Progressive Synagogue, but others are called liberal synagogues. And then there's Reform. Reform largely began with the establishment of West London Synagogue, which is a very interesting place. And among other things, that began in 1840. So Reform Judaism began in Germany in 1819 in Zezen. And then we often look to the next major step being the Hamburg Temple in 1850. So 1840 is pretty early, and West London Synagogue became the principal location for lightening up of regulations of traditional Judaism in the United Kingdom over time. And it formed the basis for what became Reform Judaism. Ironically, there's a big struggle going on, which fortunately I don't know any details of, between West London Synagogue at this moment for the last few years and the Reform movement, which is, it's gone through also through various names. For a while it was called the Movement for Reform Judaism, and I understand now that they've shortened it up and they're just calling it Reform Judaism. Rabbis move from one to the other fairly frequently, depending on where there's a position that's available. But the differences are fairly steep, and they go well into the experience of worship that one might have. So you might say, well, they're both progressive. How different can they be? Actually, quite different. And there's been talk about unifying the two movements for at least since I've been in the United Kingdom, which is, I moved there permanently in 2011. And there was talk then that, oh, sooner or later we'll have just one movement. After all, why waste our effort with two? But that's not happening. It's a little bit, some of you will be familiar with the experience of Chrysler and Mercedes trying to unify. It's not just about the fact that they're the same car business, and it's not just about the fact that these two movements are in the same Jewish business. It's also institutional memory and institutional history. So the history of the music is complicated. There's one book that became very popular, and it's alternately, depending on which copy you have, sometimes it's called the Gray Book and sometimes it's the Green Book, but it's a collection of the music that became central to the Anglo-Jewish experience, including traditional. And a lot of that music was written by Mombach, some of whose music is known here, but he really became the most important composer whose work originally would have been for organ and choir, and then became the tune that people know, in the same way that it's probably known here. People know that? Yeah. So that was written by Louis Lewandowski, and it's for organ and choir. And it sounds completely different when you hear it that way, but it's a great tune. And that's true for a lot of the tunes that have become popular in synagogues in the United Kingdom. So sometimes, incidentally, people think that the reform movement in the UK is somehow related to the reform movement here, and it isn't. They have different institutional histories, different Siddur and Mahzor. The liturgies are completely different. The characterization, the thing that characterized West London Synagogue, and its full name is the West London Synagogue for British Jews. Why would they say that? After all, what other kind of Jews are they looking for? But at the time, the Sephardic group was separate from the Ashkenazic group, and this was a way to unify them. And also because many of the Jews were in the East London, but they started to move to the West End. That is the reason why it's the West London Synagogue. But at the same time, there was a kind of a liberalizing of the liturgy and other aspects as well. The current sanctuary was built a little earlier than this one in 1870. The one here, I believe, dates to 1907. So if anybody who grew up at the Road of Shalom in Pittsburgh would find the sanctuary at West London Synagogue to be kind of homelike. But for most congregation, for most people going there, it would not be so familiar. But you're very fortunate that you have such a gorgeous sanctuary. So what are some standouts? There's West London Synagogue, which has an organ, and it's still kept up and used for virtually every service, and a choir, a professional choir. The organist, I think the current one is the 5th organist since the congregation began. They live a long time. He doesn't think he's going to make it. The previous organist, Chris Bowers Broadbent, retired just this year after serving the congregation for over 50 years. And there was a music director, Sidney Fixman, who'd been there for many years when I first came about 10 years ago. So there's a long tradition of particular kinds of music. And that kind of music that they're accustomed to is what was probably here some years ago. That is organ accompanied with a choir, and generally speaking, either a professional choir or a volunteer choir that was really good. There are recordings actually of some of the German congregations from just before the war. Somebody went around and made some recordings, and I didn't bring any of those with me, but they're just amazing. Of the sound of the choirs and the soloists that they had in Germany. It was, we sometimes think of that style of music as being a little bit, outdated, a little bit of a dinosaur, but it wasn't then. It was exciting, it was inspiring, and people were deeply moved by it. And when you listen to it, you get that same feeling. So I do want to give you a little sense of what that's like, because I promised that you would hear something you hadn't heard before. So now this was a recording that used to be handed out to B'nai Mitzvah. Up until quite recently, every bar mitzvah kid would get a history of the West London Synagogue. It's called A Beacon of Light. And they would get this recording of the music of the synagogue. And I don't know how many 13-year-olds in this day and age take a CD, which looks to them like something from the Dark Ages, and play the music that's on it. It was made about 20 years ago, so there's been some changes. There have been some changes since. I wasn't able to get much of any of the current music recorded because the choir is professional. They would need to be somehow remunerated for the use of it. But all those were taken care of 20 years ago, so that's free. So I went and asked the ritual director, Mickey Nathanson, for a copy of the CD, and he says, we don't have any more. We've given them all away. So fortunately, Rabbi David Mitchell, one of the 2 senior rabbis, had them on his computer, had the digital files. So let's play this particular version of Ahavat Olam. That's the first CD. Yeah. I have no idea what a 13-year-old would these days would think about this. There probably are some who would say, wow, this is great. So I'm curious what people think. This is just the first of a few things that we can listen to. What's your reaction to it? It is not something that was that particular version of Ahavat Olam. I never heard it. It's, as far as I know, it's only there. It's a little more modern than Mombach. I don't know the composer. But I never heard it here, even in more traditional. I mean, I grew up at Emmanuel congregation in Chicago. It's not something that we did there. What do people think? Yeah,
I think.
Yeah,
I think it's a beautiful piece, but
yeah,
I've never heard it. But I've heard something similar to that.
yes. And what it's similar to is the music, to some degree, the great treasury of North American choral music that was designed around organ and choir. The big difference, I think, if there's any one significant turning point, is that in 1948, the School of Sacred Music, we're now called the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music, which is a whole volume right there in the terminology, was established in New York, and that created generations of cantors who, for many years, were classically trained singers, some of them with successful opera careers, who became the cantors of their congregations. Many of them also had traditional backgrounds, so they were familiar with what cantorial music sounds like and could combine the nusach, that is the foundation of Jewish synagogue music, and the vocal and musical training of, well, New York, of an American classical tradition. So that became the basis for the American, what we hear in the US, and it's based around having a cantor. In the Reform movement, it tended to be baritones, whereas in more traditional synagogues, you tend to hear either a tenor or somebody who wanted to be a tenor. And, so I think it's the School of Sacred Music that's really the beginning of something that went in a particular direction that did not happen in the UK. I remember when I went in 1998, I decided to go to a foreign country, and I went to England, which weirdly now I live in. And somebody suggested that I go to services somewhere, and it was this little. I don't know where it was. I can't remember any details about it. It's a long time ago. But basically, the service was accompanied by one guy playing trombone. That was it. So, organizationally speaking, there are, first of all, Judaism in general, and progressive Judaism in particular, is not widespread all over the UK. There are little spots of it here and there, but basically it's centered principally in London, and then to some degree in Manchester and Birmingham. And then you have little odd places like I served for 10 years. I went to the Lincolnshire Progressive Community, which is Lincoln had a head start on expelling the Jews. They did it in 1215, I think, and Jews weren't expelled from the entirety of the UK, well, UK of England, until 1290. But in the town of Lincoln, there's a little building that's from the 12th century, and it has two entrances. One of them is called Jew's House, and the other Jew's Court. Jew's House probably was the home of Aaron the Jew. The terminology there, it's so strange. He's standing in front of Jew's house. It's just for an American ear, that always sounded so strange to me. And Jew's Court may very well have been where synagogue services were. There's a niche, a kind of a cutout in the wall, which the congregation that's there now uses as an ark, and probably could very well have been used that way in the 12th century. The congregation, which is liberal, was established after 700 years of no Jews in Lincoln, which is kind of amazing. That's the sort of thing you get in in England. Many of you, of course, probably know the UK better than I do, but the situation for Jews there is just odd. There are so many places you go where there aren't any Jews at all, or where there are tiny little communities. The luxury of a big community like this is that there's always somebody, either a professional or a non-professional, to do the work, which sometimes means that people don't value it as much. In those little communities that I've served now quite a few of, if somebody doesn't show up, it's a major event. So you really show up, because there's a lot riding on everybody's participation. It's a great lesson for those of us that have become accustomed to the luxury of big communities. So in London, there is West London Synagogue, which is in the West End, about 3,000 members, I think, although I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's big. And then there's the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, which is in St. John's Wood. It's easy to get mixed up and go to the other congregation in St. John's Wood, which is United Synagogue. United Synagogue is Orthodox. That's the organized Orthodox community there, of which the late and much lamented Lord Jonathan Sachs was the chief rabbi at one time. And if you haven't read his stuff, it's really good, incidentally. Good for progressives as well. In many cases, he was quite a guy whom I did not have the honor of knowing. So let's play another cut. Let me just see what's the next one on there. Let me just see. Let's do the Ein Kamocha. Can you see it down there?
I see.
A little farther down. Actually, I wonder what no, do you see on the page you're looking at, fourth down from the top, it says Tzadik Tamar. Let's listen to that. It might be the Lewandowski. Not sure. Me too. I love it. A whole different experience from singing the tune. Yes.
When did they start playing music like this at West London?
Well, the building went up in 1870 and the organ was built in, so at least
The reason that I asked that question is I lived there in the mid-1970s and I don't remember hearing anything like.
Did you go to West London at
Yeah.
that time? Yeah, that's odd.
We were members of West London.
Oh, well, your experience predates mine.
Yeah.
But I'm unaware of it ever being any different than this, but you actually had that experience, so.
Well, I mean, it was a long time ago and my memory is.
I know the feeling. I'm lucky if I can remember what I had for breakfast. So, yeah, I don't know the answer to that when it started. My understanding was that it's been that way since the building went up in 1871. I could be wrong about that. Yes.
I'm wondering, the recordings are gorgeous. I'm wondering how congregational the singing is.
Oh, not at all.
Not at all.
Oh, no.
So people don't come to sing and participate. It's-
Oh, no. That's for the professional. It's a whole other ethos.
Yeah.
What you're referring to, and I have another lecture about this subject, is the revolution in American synagogue music in the 80s and 90s, when suddenly the only thing that mattered was that everybody could sing it, which fortunately for us all was not also applied to sermon giving. If we could all sing along with the sermon, it might not be any better, and to some degree that's true for the music as well. But no, participation did not happen as far as I know. I had a group of friends who we all liked to sing at Emmanuel congregation. We had a cantor and we had organ and choir. I remember wondering whether there was a recording up there, but there were actually live people, I never saw them as a child growing up. So yeah, that's not something that the experience of Reform Judaism, and this is true here, and many of you will remember it very well, here and in the United Kingdom, was we present you with the majesty, you sit back and understand your place in the world, which is to listen and be moved. And it works pretty well, but it's a little one-dimensional. And then there was this revolution, both from the campers at the many places that the summer camp movement that revolutionized Jewish living in the really, I'd say the principal period is in the 80s, but it both predated and postdated that. So no, I don't think anybody's saying anything. Do other people remember singing along with anything in the
Shema.
The Shema? You would sing that? Yeah, and was it da 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 da? Yeah. So, there's both the West London Synagogue and the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, which is the flagship congregation of Liberal Judaism, are largely dominated by organ and choir. And they have professional choirs, paid singers that do very much like what I used to do when I sang in choirs a lot, and I would sing in synagogues and churches and whatever. It's basically the same job from the point of view of the singer. So that's the basic idea. Now, West London Synagogue had a British music director, Sidney Fixman, and the Liberal Jewish Synagogue has for a number of years, I don't know how long she's been there, Kathy Heller-Jones is the director of music at Liberal Jewish Synagogue. She is an American, and she has kept in touch with the American traditions. So she'll do a lot of the music, and I brought her some as well. Music by Ben Steinberg, for instance, and the other great exemplars of the North American choral tradition, which is much richer than the British one, I have to say. But it's really interesting. The longtime organist who recently retired, Chris Bowers-Broadbent, has written a lot of quite sophisticated music for the synagogue. Incidentally, you might guess from his name, Chris Bowers-Broadbent is not Jewish. Neither have any of the organists been. And a lot of the music that's done in the synagogue has been written by the organists who were there. None of them were Jewish. So, and people take that for granted. And it's funny because when I was in Toronto, they wouldn't even hire a secretary that wasn't Jewish. It was a basic idea there that everybody who participated in the professional side of Jewish life was Jewish. That wasn't the case. It's certainly not the case in England. You could never find anybody.
It's been similar in Road of Shalom for the organist, music director role. And the choir. When we had a quartet also, there have been exceptions, but
it's hard to find Jewish singers, to be honest. That's the moment when you realize how few Jews there are. There's just not enough of us to make choir. Well, you can, but professional singers, not so many. There was, of course, a golden age of opera when you had Tucker and that whole generation of singers. It's not the same now. Let's play something else, and then I'm going to do a couple of other things for you as well. Let's see what looks interesting here. Go down a little. What's that? Bottom. Whoops.
Excuse me, can I ask you? a question?
Sure, of course.
You said there is not a great tradition of choir music in the UK, is that a great?
No, it's a great tradition of choral music. Yes, absolutely.
But not in the Jewish.
No, the choral music is what they do have, what they don't have is cantors.
Oh, okay, I misunderstood, sorry.
Yeah, when I got there, so, we'll take a look at the, Sim Shalom. I'm curious which one that is, but don't play it just yet. When I got to the UK in 2011, there was one credentialed cantor, a British woman named Zoe Jacobs, who had gone to the School of Sacred Music. The thing is that the School of Sacred Music now produces cantors who are principally guitar song leaders. They do other things as well. Some of them have good voices, but you don't really have to in order to be good at song leading. And so she came back with that ethos firmly embedded. Following her, a couple of other cantors, well, I came, but I was serving congregations as a spiritual leader, not specifically as a cantor, because it really just wasn't a known thing. Since then, Tamara Wolfson came, and so there are 3 of us all together right now. There were a couple of more who came and left. Sarah Grabiner went to Israel, I believe. That were graduates, that were credentialed cantors. The more traditional movements do have cantors. There are a few, but it doesn't influence the progressive side very much. And choirs are a big feature of British musical life generally. There's a lot of amateur choirs, a lot of professional singers there, and there's that whole cathedral system where you start out as a boy originally it was all boys, in the choir and then progress upwards, and they're very well trained musically and so forth. So there's a lot of that sort of thing, and people expect a choir and they expect it to sound good. Let's play this next thing.
Thank you.
Oh, you're more than Just listen to a bit of it because I know you know it. Say it's a deadly. Max Janowski knew very well the Canterbury tradition, and as did Franz Van Steinberg. So you have to have both in order to make it really work. Here's how it is. To do with this. You can stop this one now. You can hear that's a professional singer who's got notes in front of him. He doesn't know how that music sounds at all because it's not something that they've ever had a chance to hear. And that's, wow, they really don't get it. Well, I mean, that's it. Yes.
Oh, no, I don't want, just commenting, I'm surprised. Am I the only one who's in late 90s here? That was all we had. I grew up in Roseville. We always had a choir. We had a professional choir. You were.
Yeah, I grew up with that too. And I mean, I'm not in my late 90s yet, but
We had I grew up with Freedom. It
yeah.
was, by the way, he wanted to be so much into reform that we weren't allowed to speak in Hebrew. None of it was in Hebrew. But we had, so when it changed from being a choir, I was very surprised. I sort of, you missed it very
Yeah.
much.
Oh, I understand that.
Professional, and the music was lovely.
What did it feel like? Did you feel the need, did you miss the fact that you weren't singing along?
Well, I don't know who sang along.
I'm asking, you,
No.
did you? And if you didn't, did it bother
We
you?
didn't sing. I don't think we did.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
They
We
were
didn't-
professional and
Yeah.
we had a director for the professional. And we got to know who was who,
Yeah,
and who was expect. It's been quite a change for me. I
Of
mean,
course.
I'm like almost 97, so it's, seeing what's coming
good
now.
on you.
Well, life changes.
yeah, I know.
I can't stop that. But it was more thrilling, frankly, to hear the choir in a service.
That's a nice way to put it. It's that it's thrilling.
That's right.
Now, it's not the same, I think. People say, well, we're not going to a concert, we're going to a service, and they're right, but it's not the same.
That was true.
Yeah.
It was very inspiring,
Yeah.
and
That's the thing that's missing now very often.
I missed it for a number of years. I mean,
Oh, it's been 20 years minimum, maybe more, that changes happen.
everything changed.
And sometimes it's good.
Sometimes we're good.
I'm gonna take a few questions, and then, so let me first hear, and then I get to you in a second.
I just had a comment.
Sorry, point.
with Mary saying, a few years behind her, but grew up here.
Mhm.
And no, you didn't miss not singing because you weren't used to singing. You didn't know
They
it.
had people for that.
The only time there was singing was when the religious school choir sang.
Oh. Yes.
On that same tune, sorry, unintended. There was something that I heard you say I believe in regards to being brought into the service and the liturgical music by listening instead of singing along. Yet in service this morning, I also heard something a lot about listening versus just rotely saying something, like being fully present. And one of the issues I have with being fully present is too much Hebrew because I don't understand it. So how can it impact my soul? I do see with the music that it can impact that, but with the words, I struggle with that. I'm
Yeah, I
curious.
think a lot of people do. I don't want to talk too much about that at the moment, just because it kind of strays a little bit outside of this purview, and there's so much to be said about what Greg raised earlier and you. That really is more about the way music is done in synagogues generally, and in America in particular, and then in this synagogue most specifically. That it needs to be certainly to be addressed. In principle, I mean, I've never found it difficult to get involved in the text in the Hebrew, even before I understood any of it. It works for me because the music can do it for you. In here, it's not uncommon to have English mixed in with the Hebrew in the songs that people have been writing for the last 20, 30 years. Whereas in the UK, I never hear it. And I think people would be shocked to hear anything. Let me just, because we're going to run out of time, and I want you to hear something besides just me talking. And then I promise to get to those who were. So the other thing that I discovered was that there's a lot of the tunes that for instance, when we processed with the Torah, the first tune we did was Lecha Adonai Hagedula Behagevura Behatiferet, which you probably know from a long time ago too. That's by Epros, I'm pretty sure. So they don't do that in London. They do two different ones. One by Mombach, which is, oh, sorry, wrong piece. Okay, how about in music? But it's Lecha Adonai Hagedula Vehagura Vehatiferet Vehanetzach Vehahod. And the first time I heard it, I'm like, what's that? Why are they not doing the traditional one? Turns out they are, just a different tradition. When I first got to the UK, I was engaged to lead services, and I didn't know any of the music that they did. So I did what I knew. And people found that quite as difficult as if somebody came in here and started doing all the British stuff. So this is a version of Esa Einai. We know a number of them here. The very popular one that's the Karlbach that people hear is Esa Einai El Hehari Me'ayin Me'ayin Yahweh, which actually is from a tradition in the Orthodox world of kind of popularizing and making more participatory the music. But I had never heard this. And so, Ezri me'im Adonai it's nice, but I've never heard it until I got there. And that's by Charles Verinder, who was one of the non-Jewish organists. I mean, all of the organists were not Jewish. One of the organists at West London Synagogue. That became standard throughout pretty much all of the congregations in the UK. So we did an Adon Olam during our services here that you hadn't heard, well, probably you hadn't heard before, by Charles Osborne, who's a living composer. He's in Toronto now. He has my old job there. That's the one, Adon Olam Asher Malach, which people really love, and I really love it. But if you think Adon Olam, the one you mostly know is Adon Olam Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra. That's by Garavich. That is done, but not very much in the UK. The ones that you're more likely to hear are Adon Olam Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra, Le'et Nasa V'eto, Azar Melech Shemo Nivra. That over and over again. Nice tune, actually. And then this is by another one of the Simon Whaley. Does not sound like a Jewish name. Although the other thing you find in the UK is that lots of people who are Jews have names that don't give any proof that they're Jews. They tended to conceal. And after living in the UK for a while, I went back to, I was back in Los Angeles where my late wife was from, and we're driving down a street and there's these banners, Jewish this and Jewish that, give to the UJA. And I'm like, keep it down. I suddenly felt like, I'm not embarrassed, just like, they shouldn't know we're Jewish, don't, not out in front of the goyim. Something like that. I'm not getting the feeling across very well, but in England, they don't do that. You never know anybody who's Jewish. They don't have Jewish names very often. They were changed when they arrived from Europe and so forth. So it's that's very different. And then, as I say, the community, there's liberal Jewish synagogue is quite large, big, beautiful building, not like the sanctuary here. It's fairly modern. And West London Synagogue, also very large. Then there's, they've changed the name of it. It used to be called the, they often name synagogues after the street they're on. It might have an official name somewhere, but generally it'll be called, Aleph. Aleph is one of the Reform synagogues. It's on a street called Aleph Gardens. So, so one of the things that happened was that here there was a real revolution in synagogue music, and that's essentially great. What you were referring to, the rise of participatory music, driven partly by the great talents of pretty much two people, Debbie Friedman and Jeff Klepper. Jeff worked with Dan Freelander, but Dan Freelander he's got a lovely voice, but he's not a composer or a songwriter, and Jeff is. And Debbie Friedman, who was quite remarkable at that, very charismatic. Some of you will have seen her in concerts or so on and so forth. She died a few years ago, as many of you will know. Sorry, was she here?
She was here.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did a concert here.
It was Johnstown, you have.
I had her in Johnstown.
Oh, yeah, and for a concert?
Yeah.
Yeah, she was the very, as I
She
said,
had a big concert.
yeah, and she really could bring them out of the woodwork. And very few of the people writing now have the same kind of influence or the same kind of talent that she did. You know, she would find like the thing that Judaism needed. It needed a healing prayer. So she wrote one that for years was the only one you would ever hear. It's gotten a little bit tired now, and people don't sing it as much. But you like it still?
The best, yes.
Yeah.
Even though it was written after 1900.
I think it will.
Yeah.
So, yeah, her charisma and talent were quite remarkable. It was not a kind of music that I was crazy about, but you know, I can do it. But that became, it really was a revolution in this country. But that revolution, once it was over, I mean, people were walking out of synagogues. If somebody walked in with a guitar, like half the congregation would leave. What's that doing in here? And some of you may remember that feeling. I managed to miss the summer camp experience for a variety of reasons. I think I was 2 weeks at Economwalk, and that was it. I'm not sure exactly why the family didn't push for that. I might not have been that enthusiastic for it. But that's where it's at it's the summer camp movement that generated that, but it really upset people. Do people remember being upset by the guitar coming?
Me having a guitar here is weird. Like when there was a lot of discussion about me actually bringing.
So that's an example of that, yeah.
That had not really happened before I got.
And you know, a big piece of it is the architecture. There's something that work in one, I mean, you know, I do music for Lincoln. I'm not there now, but when I was doing Lincoln, that's a tiny little room that can seat maybe 20, 25 people. If you brought a guitar, that would be fine. I don't play guitar, so I didn't, I just sang. But if you couldn't put a piano in there, there's no room for it, there wouldn't be room for the congregation. So that's one thing. But if you did an entire service, I mean, I don't know what the tradition is here, maybe you do in fact do that, an entire service that's guitar led in a sanctuary like this or like West London Synagogue, and it disappears because the room just absorbs the sound. And then throw it back, but you have to give it a lot to make it work. Now I may be going against something that's already been going on here, and you can do a lot with the sound system as well. But a lot of the traditions of Jewish music here and in the UK predate sound systems. You just had to, you know, that's what the organ is for, is to fill the space. An organ in a synagogue or in a church is part of the architecture it's built in. Couple of more questions. I know people have them, and then we're going to have to end soon. Yes.
I served a congregation in the Reformed congregation in Glasgow.
Yes.
And it was part of the RSGB, Reformed
Yep.
Synagogue of Great Britain. But that was the only Reformed congregation in all of Scotland.
That's right. Because
Now-
in Edinburgh, it's liberal.
Right. But
And it's tiny.
it didn't even exist at that time. I was
Yeah,
in
it's
the
pretty
late
small.
60s. It was very small. I mean, I went there a couple of times. But I'm talking about the music. There was no history of that in that congregation of, you know, choirs.
What did you do? What kind of music did you have in Glasgow?
Well, but they had very similar music, but it was very, from what I gathered, they said it was strains of Sephardic influences.
Right, and that's a big piece of the history of Jews in the UK is the Sephardic influence, which was very big.
So even for the high holidays, we never had a cantor. The two you know, there were two big people from the congregation who helped the rabbi.
Yeah,
And it was such that when I got there, for instance, for the Avinu Malkeinu, everybody knew, everybody would participate. The Igdal for the Adon Olam and the
do you
Igdal.
remember which tune you used there?
Havana Mountain, because that's the same synagogue I used to go.
No.
Oh, you went there too?
Yeah, it's just outside Brownsville.
Yeah.
It's very small. When I went there, it was a woman.
It's hard to remember stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
You know,
But-
I'm asking a lot.
No, but I mean, I grew up in Bombay and there were totally different melodies.
Which is also very interesting, as we talked the other day, Rachel Muslat is kind of
Right.
distributing a lot of that music, which is very nice.
But, there was influences of Sephardic and others that, but for instance, for Adon Olam, I mean, growing up every week, we did that as part of our Kiddush at home. And depending on the time of the year, there were, I don't know what, a dozen or more melodies of Adon Olam. There were melodies, we did the Holy Iktar, and there were different melodies. There was a wedding in the community, you did the wedding. Sorry, if it was the high holidays, you did that.
Mhm. Let's listen to a little more of this recording. I'm finding it very interesting myself. Let's see what we have. Let's hear what they do for the Vishamru at the bottom of that. So that's something that's still done, although usually it's a mezzo who does the solo part at West London. So another of the large and influential, musically influential congregations is what's now called the Ark Synagogue in London. The founding, I think he's the founding rabbi, was Andrew Goldstein. His son, Aaron Goldstein, is now the senior rabbi there. His daughter, Ruth, is the music director. And she's a good musician, and they have volunteer choir. And they do a pretty wide variety of music, but they know, and also Andrew's wife knows a lot of this music as well. So if you're in the same room with them, you can say, oh, what did you used to do for whatever, and they'll just burst into song. Very often, they're the tune of the choral setting. So what you would originally have heard would have been the choir. They remember the tune, and that's what they do there. just, the lead sheet, just the notes of the melody plus harmonies thrown in. So it's, I would say that by and large, it's a tradition waiting to be, first of all, somehow revived. I find some of the performances so deadly slow that I'm looking at my watch through the whole thing. And that's not the fault of the music, which is often very good, very solid stuff, but it's just, there's a certain kind of decay that's set in about the music. It's as if people stop caring about it. That's the way it sounds to me as a professional musician.
The Bishop Rue was a lot slower than what we did.
Sorry?
The Bishop Rue that you just did, it was a lot slower.
Oh, well, we're never gonna get that time back. And yet those are, all professional quality singers, they're professional singers, in fact. Like, who's in charge here? I think that was Sidney Fixman, who was, when I knew him, he was already pretty old, but this predates that. So, yeah, it's, I think there's a way, and that was my experience of listening to that kind of material in the recording from the Berlin and Vienna synagogues that was made before World War II, is that music was thrilling. That's the right word for it. When it's done well, it's both thrilling and inspiring. And my feeling about Judaism generally is it's a very big pool of tradition, both old and new. And as Reform and progressive Jews, I say, because Reform in the UK is only one of the two, in progressive synagogues and in progressive Jewish life, we have the ability to take from wherever it is. Everything from Debbie Friedman working backwards to Ben Steinberg to Max Elfman, who wrote some really wonderful stuff that we don't hear much anymore. And unfortunately, the cantors these days are trained mostly, I mean, they do learn Nusach. I don't know, I mean, it's changed a lot since I was there. But there's a lot of emphasis on participatory music, which I get, and people do like to sing, and people are often inspired by it in a different way. It can really work. But they kind of lose touch with with important traditions of Jewish music that predate what's going on today. And I think that's true for me for a lot of more traditional stuff, which if it speaks to me, I want to be able to do it. And that's both with the great choral music that we've heard for 50 years in synagogues in the US, but also Nusach, the cantor-led unaccompanied material that can sometimes make the text come alive for you when you hear it, if you're willing to listen to it. So we have time for a few more comments, and then I think there's something else going on at 2:30. Isn't there?
Yeah.
So we got like 1 minute, so we really desperate to talk. Anybody? Anybody? Don't leave me with a last word. Yes.
Is there more or less Hebrew in the UK with the services that you're familiar with than there is here? More or less?
Well, okay, so first of all, I mean, more or less is the right answer. And just briefly, the Siddur for liberal Judaism is a little bit heavier on English. They're talking about replacing it, but that's the one they've had for 20 years or so. And the Siddur for Reform Judaism has a lot more Hebrew, a lot more traditional text in it. But in the event, the services are not too different because you can always skip the Hebrew and do the English, and they to some degree do that. I'd say Reform feels a little bit more traditional, and there is more Hebrew in it than in liberal. Liberal is what you'd probably find that the most similar to what you know. But there's still some Hebrew in it. What was your experience?
I found the Reform was a lot more Hebrew.
Yeah, that it certainly was
the
then. And
Liberals were trying to get to that point. I mean,
yeah,
I think the Reform came up with a new prayer book when I was
probably Service of the Heart.
yeah.
Yeah,
So Service of the Heart,
yeah.
there's a liberal, yeah.
No,
Is
right.
West London liberal?
Reform.
Reform.
It was the founding congregation for Reform Judaism, but right now they're fighting about things that I cannot even figure out.
I belonged to a Reform synagogue in Manchester for many years.
Which one?
A small one, yeah, Manchester. I can't remember the name, it was a very small one.
Ah.
And the rabbi was from Australia.
Oh, who was it?
He then, by the time I left Manchester, he had left already.
Oh.
He went back to Australia with his wife. And then he insisted on the English, actually. And we had a lot, in that particular synagogue, we had a lot of English in the services.
Mm-hmm.
We sang a lot. There was no professional choir, everybody was volunteer.
So there was a choir?
For the big holidays, for the
Right.
high holidays, yes, but it was all people from the congregation that would volunteer. And the music director was a Russian woman, the leading master, and she was a professional musician, and she was the director. But that was one place where I remember that the services were a lot more in English than in Hebrew.
Yeah, I generally associate the more Hebrew with the Reform, but your experience is different, at least the way it was then when you were there in Manchester.
Yeah.
It's in a way, there's a few core traditions that book, Songs of Prayer and Praise, I think it's called, which is the collection of all the old stuff, pretty much 19th, early 20th century choral settings. And then there's the different traditions that each congregation has. There are some tunes that are kind of shared around, like the Adon Olam that we Adon Olam Hashem Anat, that you hear pretty much everywhere. And now it's beginning to be permeated because we had a revolution in this country, but it wasn't a revolution in the UK. It was just like, oh, we can do this and we can add that.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things have been changing more gradually there, not in a kind of a revolutionary way, and people aren't as alienated by the change. Just to conclude, West London Synagogue does have what they call their Shira service, which is to some degree participatory, but it's very, very different in feeling to what you might be. It's guitar, there's guitar played, but it's not the predominant sound. And they have a classically trained singer who knows the American repertoire very well. She is originally from New York, Maya Levy. She's got a gorgeous voice. I could listen to her sing all day. So that is an alternative service. People will come sometimes for the 6 o'clock service, which is organ and choir. And then at 7:15, there's the Shira service, which is this whole other feeling. And that, you know, the Adonai Sfatai Tiftach that we've been doing, Adonai Sfatai Tiftach, which is so beautiful. I first heard that there, although it was written by Natalie Young, who I believe is an American-based actor. Yeah.
Hello.
So there we
The
are.
rabbi was called Brian Paul.
Oh, I think I've heard the name, but he wasn't there with some, I'm only there for like 10, 11 years now.
No, he left doing that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your questions. And thanks to Paige for sitting in on this and controlling everything very well. Thank you so much.